this is going to be an interview you're going to want to share with your friends, your family, colleagues, and neighbors. Anyone that you care about needs to hear this information. I'm very grateful to have on the line Helen Caldicott. She's a pediatrician and one of the few professionals speaking truth about the horrors of Fukushima. Helen, thanks so much for joining us.
That's my pleasure.
It's a real pleasure to have you on. If I may, let me read something to you from May 21st, 2011. I did a micro-documentary called The Reality Detached American, and it started this way. As the world teeters on the edge of a financial debt tsunami and a nuclear ecological Armageddon, I remain in awe by the fact that most of my friends, neighbors, and colleagues appear to be completely unfazed, in fact, completely oblivious to the horrifying events now unfolding globally. At no point has any of the people I know made any mention of the horrifying tsunami or the current nuclear nightmare unfolding in Japan. So Helen, why don't we start at the beginning and take us back to the earthquake and tsunami on March 11th, 2011, and then bring us up to date. At that point, I will ask some of my very many questions.
There was a massive earthquake, as you know, 9 on the Richter scale, followed by a huge tsunami, 45 feet high, which went over the seawall. And during the process, the 6 reactors at Fukushima lost their external power supply, meaning that the pumps couldn't work because they had no electricity. And each reactor needs 1 million gallons a minute of water to flow through it to keep it cool, otherwise it will melt down. So they had in that contingency a whole lot of huge diesel generators below the reactors, as large as houses, but they got drowned. Then they had a few ordinary batteries, but they didn't really work. So the end of it was that units 1, 2, 3, and 4 lost their power supply. The pumps failed to work, and within a few hours, units 1, 2, and 3 started to melt down. Within about 3 days, units 1, 2, and 3 had melted down, which means over 100 tons of extremely hot fissioning radioactive uranium turned into a molten sort of larval mass, melted its way through 6 inches of steel in the reactor vessel, melted its way sort of as a glob onto the containment floor made of steel and concrete. And it is not known, but there's quite a strong possibility that 1, 2, or 3 of them could have melted their way right into the earth. Now, TEPCO, or General Electric, actually built these reactors, and I know the 3 engineers who built them and resigned in 1995 because they knew that they were so dangerous.
Those were Mach 1 reactors from GE, correct?
GE Mach 1, and you've got 23 of them operating in the United States.
And just so people understand, Helen, the spent fuel in Mach 1 reactors, the spent fuel is stored on top of those reactors, is that correct?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
So TEPCO, which is Tokyo Electric Power Company, and GE, they excavated about 35 feet of cliff to put the reactors down lower near the sea so that they can have access to seawater to keep them cool, etc. But the reactors were built on an ancient riverbed, and behind the reactors are mountain ranges. And water pours down from the mountains beneath the reactors out to the sea and has always done so. When the reactors were intact, that was all fine. Now there's molten cores, 3 of them extremely radioactive, which are being bathed by the water coming down from the mountains because either the containment vessels, well, they're broken and the water pours in, and or 1 or 2 or more of the cores are in the earth being bathed by the water, and that water is incredibly radioactive. And every day since March 11th, 2011, 300 to 400 tons of radioactive water have been pouring out into the Pacific Ocean. Also, they're pumping in about 300 tons of water a day to keep the cores cool, otherwise they could explode again or have another fission reaction, so they have to keep them cool. That water is then pumped out and put in over 1,000 huge metal tanks that have been put together by inexperienced workers with plastic rubber seals or corroding bolts, and many of those tanks are leaking highly radioactive water. So should there be another earthquake greater than 7 on the Richter scale, though many of the tanks would collapse and the water would pour into the Pacific. Apart from that, they're running out of room to make the tanks, and therefore they're now talking about just pouring this highly radioactive water along with the rest into the Pacific. And the fishermen are extremely annoyed, as you can imagine, because their fish are already radioactive and they'll become much more so. Now, as well as the reactors melting down, there were 5 explosions, hydrogen explosions, because when the zirconium, which clads the fuel rods, which are 1/2 an inch thick and 12 feet long, it gets very hot. It reacts with water forming hydrogen. And the reactors were not designed to vent the hydrogen adequately, and the hydrogen built up and exploded in the 4 reactors. But also right now, hydrogen is still building up in reactors 1, 2, and 3, and so they're injecting nitrous oxide into the reactor buildings to dilute the hydrogen continuously so there are not more hydrogen explosions. Now, Building 3 was seriously damaged by the earthquake. Building 4 also seriously damaged. Just before the earthquake, serendipitously, they removed the full core, over 100 tons of highly radioactive fuel, into a cooling pool based 100 feet above the ground on the roof of Building 4. They all have cooling pools on their roof 100 feet above the ground. The roof of the cooling pool was blown off, as it was in most other reactors, except I think Building 2. And if there is another earthquake greater than 7 on the Richter scale, Building 4, it is thought, will collapse. Down will come the fuel pool containing about, I think, 400 tons of extremely radioactive fuel. The water will, of course, dissipate. The zirconium cladding the rods will catch fire, and there could be a huge nuclear fire producing 10 times more cesium than was produced and extruded at Chernobyl. And incidentally, 40% of the European landmass is still radioactive because of Chernobyl. Nuclear accidents never end because the radioactive elements last for hundreds to thousands of years. And it would be releasing as much radiation as that released by 14,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. That radiation would go up into the air, especially if there's a big fire, up into probably the troposphere and stratosphere, and move from west to east around the northern hemisphere. As the 2 air masses at the equator do not mix, most of the fallout from the air will occur in the northern hemisphere, and of course North America will get a lot, but also the European countries and the like. Because they are very worried about the situation, they have reinforced the building enough so that they can put a very heavy crane on the top of the building 4 to remove the fuel rods and put them in great big concrete casks and move them to another water-cooled storage situation, cooling pool. Now, normally this is a very delicate operation orchestrated by computers because there are only millimetres to spare between the rods. In fact, the rods are in bundles. I think there are about 85 fuel rods in a bundle, fuel bundles. And so the fuel bundle is pulled out. It's got a hook on the top and the crane attaches to the hook. But normally this is all done by computer control because if 2 bundles touch each other, you could get a fission reaction and the whole thing would start fissioning, releasing huge amounts of radiation, and the workers would have to evacuate not just from Unit 4 but the whole complex, and therefore it would be left to smoulder alone and would produce much, much more radioactive contamination. Also, as a nuclear engineer, Arnie Gunderson said, if you've got a cigarette packet and it's bent, because it's been in your pocket for too long, and you pull out a cigarette, as you pull a cigarette out, it breaks. And similarly with these fuel bundles and rods, the structure of the pool has been bent and damaged, and it's quite likely that as they pull the rods out, some will break, releasing huge amounts of radiation again, and the workers will have to evacuate. This has never been done before by manual control, never. So it's a very tenuous operation. TEPCO has subcontracted the situation to many subcontractors, including the Yakuza, who are the Japanese mafia. And they're recruiting homeless men from the streets of Tokyo and elsewhere, people from mental hospitals, to do this work. I think most of the workers doing this very tenuous operation are probably okay, but you need to know that many of the workers are really not, and some are alcoholics and the like. So it's and it's going to take 14 months for this whole thing to end. And in the meantime, yesterday there was an earthquake 5.1 on the Richter scale just off Fukushima. I mean, no, there were two of them. So we're dealing with a very tenuous, difficult situation. The Japanese are very proud people, and they have not really invited, really, really good nuclear engineering companies like Bechtel from the United States to come in and help. They're doing it virtually alone. Oh, and they want to save money too because their shares are going down. They also want to reopen all their nuclear power plants because their shares are going down. It's all about money. And so the other very troubling situation is that there's a huge plume of radioactive water heading directly towards the west coast of the US, and I think it's already started hitting Alaska and Canada. But this month, next month in March, it will start hitting Oregon and Washington State and the like, and later this year it will start hitting California. Now, it's not just going to end, because every day up to 400 tonnes more radioactive water are being discharged into this Pacific Ocean. Now, the Pacific Ocean is a huge body of water, and the radioactive elements, of which there are probably more than 50 long-lived elements, most of which are never discussed. They will be continued to be extruded into the Pacific and moved towards the west coast. Of course, they'll be diluted, but then the solution to pollution by dilution when it comes to radiation is fallacious, because the food chain microconcentrates the elements by orders of magnitude, tens to thousands of times at each step, like in the algae, then in the crustaceans, then in the little fish, then in the big fish, and then in us, as we stand at the apex of the food chain. So that, you could catch a fish. Well, they found bluefin tuna in California carrying cesium from Fukushima. It's low concentration, but you only need, not many atoms of cesium to get into your body, into your brain or whatever, to mutate a regulatory gene which controls the rate of cell division to later give you cancer. And these elements are tasteless, odorless, and invisible. They're silent killers, and it takes any time from 2 to 80 years to develop a cancer, whether it's leukemia, lung cancer, breast cancer, bowel cancer, brain cancer, and thyroid cancer, many others. So it's a silent killer in two ways. One, you can't taste the stuff. Two, your government is not testing the fish at all yet on the west coast, nor testing the air. The FDA and EPA are not testing the fish, nor are they routinely monitoring the air crossing the North American continent. So you could be eating radioactive fish and not knowing it. They say, look, the levels are low, it's low-dose radiation, but once this stuff gets into your body, be it cesium, plutonium, americium, neptunium, strontium, tritium, and I could go on and on, these elements go to various organs, concentrate in various organs. You don't know your genes are being mutated. that control the rate of cell division. And one day, instead of the cell dividing in a controlled way by mitosis into two daughter cells, this cell will go crazy and just produce billions and trillions of cells, and that's a cancer, and we generally cannot stop cancer growth. Right. I speak now as a physician.
Let me ask you this. You've said that if the spent fuel pool in number 4 collapses, that you would evacuate your family from Boston. How close are we to that?
Who knows? Who knows if there's going to be an earthquake greater than 7 that'll disassemble building 4 and maybe building 3. And that's another terrible thing, because building 3, if that collapses onto its corium of molten lava, huge amounts of radiation will be released. So I don't know. They say it's an act of God. I don't believe in God, but who knows? We can't predict, except to say that there are many earthquakes in this area all the time, and Japan is an earthquake-ridden island, and we don't know.
Do you think we would ever know the truth of what's going on there? And the reason I ask is because we've seen coverage in the national news media here in the United States from ABC News and others that take video cameras in, saying that they're being given exclusive access to number 4 in the removal of the fuel rods, which is said to have begun. And what we see in the video being shared here in America is a pristine interior building. It doesn't look like a building in which the top blew off in a hydrogen explosion. There are many out there, like Hattrick Penry. I sent you a PDF document, a 445-page PDF document called Plumegate. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at that. But there are many that have looked at the Freedom of Information Act documents.
I've read it.
Okay, what's your take? Can we believe anything coming out of Japan, out of TEPCO, or out of the American news media?
Yes, and I think Patrick Hendrick goes too far, and I don't agree with some of the stuff he says. You've got to be really up to date with your facts and totally... The Japanese are very tidy people, and they have, by robot control and by human beings, removed the debris from the top of Building 4, and it does look pristine, but that doesn't mean a thing. They're doing a very, very, very tricky operation which could lead to disaster. On the other hand, the Japanese media is being controlled now because the government of Abe, the Prime Minister, has passed a secrecy law saying that, you know, anyone, including journalists who report on this, could be jailed for up to 10 years. Right. There are very few scientific investigations going on about what's happening to people medically. There's only one, really, and they're looking at the thyroids of children under the age of 18 in Fukushima Prefecture, and they, I think, about 200,000 children and have suspected thyroid cancer or proven thyroid cancer. Now, the incidence of thyroid cancer in children under the age of 18 is 1 to 2 per million. The Japanese government is saying, oh, it's not caused by radiation. Well, it is, obviously, by radioactive iodine and cesium and other isotopes taken up by the thyroid gland. Now, if you look at the data from Chernobyl, and there's a wonderful report published by the New York Academy of Sciences called Chernobyl, which summarizes about 5,000 papers written in Slavic, which were translated finally into English, the only really documented data on what's happening post-Chernobyl to people in the Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Children, I think in Belarus, started developing thyroid cancer a year or two after the event, but most of the thyroid cancer appeared 4 years later. So this is an early appearance of thyroid cancer in Fukushima. It appeared 2 years after the event, indicating to me as a paediatrician that these children got a whopping dose of radioactive elements into their thyroid, but not just their thyroid, their whole bodies. Thyroid starts to become malignant fairly early, as does the white blood cells to form leukemia, and we're going to start seeing leukemia soon. But those children got high doses, meaning the whole population did. 10 million people still live in highly radioactive areas, eating radioactive food, being irradiated from the elements on the ground by gamma radiation, which is like X-rays, and the radiation like cesium and strontium and the like accumulate in various bodily organs. The more radioactive food you eat, the more the elements accumulate in your body, in your bones, cause bone cancer or leukemia or multiple myeloma, or in your brain, like cesium, causing brain cancers or muscle cancers or causing sudden heart attacks. Many, many diseases are caused by radiation exposure, including diabetes, premature aging, cataracts of the lens of the eyes. I've just been through the whole book on Chernobyl, and as a physician, it's almost the scariest document I've ever read. I'm summarising it now because I'm about to go to Japan for a lecture tour, and the Japanese people really, really want to know the truth. So the only study that's being done, as far as I know, is looking at thyroids, not at the health of the children or the people in general. And there's another man called Tim Rousseau, who's an evolutionary biologist, looking at the wildlife in the exclusion zones of Chernobyl and Fukushima and finding large numbers of mutations in the birds, the insects, and the plants. Many of the male birds are sterile. They have smaller than normal brains. They have tumours. And what happens to plants, animals, and insects happens to humans because we're all part of the ecological cycle. You can follow it much more closely with animals because they reproduce faster and many generations occur within a year, whereas we take generations for our genetic abnormalities to manifest and congenital malformations.
Yeah, let me play this for the audience. Here's a piece from a press conference in which you were talking about Chernobyl and then Fukushima.
It seems that nearly 1 million people have already died as a result of Chernobyl, despite what WHO says and the IAEA. This is one of the most monstrous cover-ups in the history of medicine, because everybody should know about this. Then we extrapolate through to Japan. Japan is, by orders of magnitude, many times worse than Chernobyl.
That was you talking about Chernobyl, but essentially Fukushima is degrees worse. You know, never before have 3 nuclear meltdowns happened, and you've said the truth is they will never clean it up. It's scientifically impossible. Cesium-137 lasts for 300 years. What do you think is the very best case at this point? We know what the worst case is. It's very discouraging to consider the worst case.
I can't think of the best.
I can't either. I can't either. What do we do? Okay, let's say you're living on the West Coast. I'm in the middle of the country. Those on the East Coast, like your family in Boston. For those that are even thinking about this issue, and I can tell you that the majority of Americans aren't. Most people don't know what Fukushima is. They've forgotten about the tsunami. They don't know about the meltdowns. They're not following it. The news isn't reporting on it. People in this country are clueless. For those that aren't clueless, though, what would you recommend they do? Is there any nutritional supplements we should be taking? Potassium iodide? What would you as a doctor suggest for your own family who are in Boston?
Well, first of all, you have over 100 operating nuclear power plants in your country, so you have a right to be worried. Any of them could melt down any day, like Fukushima did. Earthquake or no earthquake, human fallibility, all sorts of things can go wrong to produce a meltdown. Every family in America should have potassium iodide tablets in their medicine cabinet. Now, what potassium iodide does is it's an inert iodine, and if you take it just before you're going to be exposed to a cloud of radioactive elements from a meltdown, just before, it blocks the uptake of radioactive iodine in your thyroid by 70%. Mm-hmm. And so you can partly protect the thyroid, although the thyroid is impacted by technetium and cesium and other elements as well. There's really nothing else you can do except to become extremely proactive and lead a peaceful revolution, a sagacious, Gandhian, wise revolution to close down all your nuclear reactors, number one. Number two, keep your eye on what's happening in Fukushima at all times. You can go to the net and find out what's happening. And should there be a major accident, well, the safest place is in the southern hemisphere. You must demand that your government look after you and test your food, the fish, and the air consistently. And you need to know that Hillary Clinton signed an agreement with the Japanese government just after Fukushima that America would keep importing food from Japan, and I think it still is. I went to a sushi restaurant in New York the other day, and it was very posh and people drinking their sakis and these gorgeous sushi chefs. And I said, where does the fish come from? They said Japan, and I couldn't believe it.
I know. I'm shocked that people still eat sushi so willingly and have no idea where the fish is coming from.
No, and so the fish I had at that restaurant came from New Zealand and I think Canada, west coast of Canada. No. Somewhere else, but it wasn't in a radioactive area. So you've got a lot of work to do to bring your government into line and to educate your politicians. And you live in a democracy, which means you are the leaders and the politicians are your representatives. And if you don't go and see them every time they come back to home base and teach them and educate them and make them read my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, you are not worthy of living in a democracy. Yeah. You have to use your democracy, and that doesn't mean just voting once every 2 years. It means making sure your representatives, including the president, represent you and your children and grandchildren and not the corporations, because when you don't act, the corporations move into the vacuum you leave and they run the whole show.
That's right. We talk about that constantly here at SGT Report, and it's called fascism, this corporatocracy that's really overtaken our government and really governments around the planet. You're in Australia. Do you suffer far fewer nuclear plants than we do?
We don't have any. They're too dangerous for us. We just sit on 1/3 of the world's richest uranium, and we export it abroad so other people can get the cancers, etc. From our uranium. It's worse than exporting heroin, because heroin only kills the users. And I'm thinking of the wonderful Philip Seymour
Hoffman.
Lovely man, who was kind of a friend of mine.
Is that right? Wow.
And the uranium in the Fukushima reactors was Australian uranium. So we're killing people. We will be killing people, and there will be hundreds of thousands of people over time in Japan developing leukemia and cancers, and babies being born deformed, as they were in Chernobyl. There are homes full of the most grossly deformed children as a result of the embryo being affected in utero, and the radiation killing cells that are going to form the left half of the brain or the eye or the like. Thalidomide babies.
Let me tell you something about Philip Seymour Hoffman and the plague, which is heroin, and the influx of heroin into this country, which has now reached levels of an absolute epidemic, and it's now encroaching into the most unsuspecting suburbs, even around where I live. And under the Taliban rule in Afghanistan, poppy production, opium production was at an all-time low, and under the U.S. military, it's at an all-time high. And then you have banks like HSBC and other international criminal banks being caught doing money laundering for Mexican drug cartels. It's we really have our backs up against the wall, Helen, in terms of the corporatocracy and the government in bed with the corporatocracy. And trying to rein these governments in is a full-time job.
The answer to drug addiction is all drugs should be legalized. All drug addicts should be put in hospitals and treated because they're sick. They're sick, and they need help. And then you would get organized crime right out of drug dealing, and drug dealing, and the drugs would go down. And that's happened in countries that have had the common sense and wisdom to legalize drugs.
That's right. Well, it has. In this country, there's something called the industrial prison complex, which preys on those that sell drugs, and then, of course, they're fed into this prison industrial system, which in many cases is privately owned. So those that bring in the drugs also own the prisons. It's very insidious, and my heart goes out to Philip Seymour Hoffman and his family. He left behind 3 small children, and it's very sad. You say you knew him, huh?
Yeah, he heard me speak once years ago, and he offered to help me, and we had breakfast in a tiny little cafe in the village, and he was all crumpled the way he always was, and he was very sweet. And he said, "Look, I don't know how I can help you at this time, but I will help you." He was a really beautiful man, and what an actor.
Yeah, I've heard from others. I do a little TV production, and I've heard from others who knew him that he was a very sincere, very sweet, very humble, very down-to-earth guy.
Yeah.
And he was plagued by this demon, and this demon of heroin. And I hold this government responsible, getting me back to my statistic about Afghanistan. It's very sad, and I know that you probably remember the Vietnam War and the drugs being brought in then too into this country, and the CIA loaded down with cocaine. It's real. We really do have our backs up against the wall, and now, with Fukushima, it just seems like it gets a little bit too much. I mean, it's so hard to worry about everything and try to rein in these out of control governments at every turn. And Fukushima just seems like it's out of our control completely.
I would say that, as in medicine on the battlefield or in a hospital where you've got patients coming in, every second, you have to triage, and you have to deal with the sickest patients first, and triage down. Nuclear power, all the reactors must be closed down because the nuclear waste, which is accruing, will say there are 70,000 tons of high-level waste, civilian waste in your country, and about as much military waste made from making nuclear weapons, will leak and pollute water supplies, concentrate in food chains, so generations hence, people wake in the morning, the breast milk already radioactive, the babies being born deformed, all with genetic disease like diabetes, cystic fibrosis, dwarfism, phenylketonuria. There are 6,000 such diseases. Children getting cancer at the age of 6 instead of 60, and epidemics of cancer, leukemia, and genetic disease. That's the legacy we're leaving to our children and descendants by fissioning uranium to boil water to make electricity. And the thing which is extremely worrying now is the ever-present threat of nuclear war. I don't know if you've been following the news, but recently over 75 officers who are at the missile bases in the Midwest have been fired because they take drugs, they're cheating, they're drinking alcohol. In fact, the man who was in charge of the missile bases, a general, was in Moscow getting drunk, cavorting with women of dubious reputations, and he was fired. They're very bored, and they they sit at their consoles, bored stiff all day, wondering whether or not that day they're going to be called to blow up the planet. America's still got 1,000 hydrogen bombs on hair trigger alert, and so does Russia. Nuclear war would take an hour to happen. All your towns with a population of 50,000 or more is targeted with at least one nuclear weapon. They're Russian bombs, and they're big bombs. America, if it was targeted and a nuclear war occurred, would burn coast to coast, north to south. You could not get into a shelter because you would be asphyxiated by the fires. You couldn't come out if you did survive because there's so much radiation. You'd die. The food would be radioactive. I can go on and on. That could happen tonight. There are over 1,000 legitimate hackers. Hackers hacking into the Pentagon systems, including probably the early warning system. I don't know how we're still here. America is arrogant and hypocritical when it says, well, North Korea can't have bombs and Iran can't have bombs or anyone else. Only we can, because we're an extraordinarily powerful power, and we will maintain that power. Unless America rises to its full moral and spiritual height, which is what Martin Luther King was talking about just before he was assassinated, and moved towards abolition of nuclear weapons with Russia, because between them they own 94% of all the nuclear weapons in the world. All other countries will emulate America, and they all want their own nuclear weapons, because if you enter the portal of the nuclear club, you're ultimately powerful. So America has a big job at hand, and I'm speaking to all of you who care. You must close down all your reactors pronto. You must stop producing CO2 pronto and go to renewables like wind, solar, geothermal, conservation, tidal power. It's all there. It's cheap as hell, much cheaper than anything you can imagine, and it would improve the GDP and employ hundreds or millions of people in America if you move to renewable energy. And I refer you to a report called carbon-free, nuclear-free, which I sponsored in 2009, which, and if you go to IEER.org, download it and read it. So you've got to abolish nuclear weapons and rise up as we did in the 80s with the Russians who are ready to do that. You close down all your reactors, and I don't know what you will do with your radioactive waste. Nobody does. I speak now as a physician practicing global preventive medicine. The world is in the intensive care unit. We are now all physicians to a planet which is dying. We possibly could save it if we all have the same commitment and dedication and love for our planet as doctors do at 3 a.m. in the morning for their patients in the intensive care unit. We don't think about ourselves. We think only about our patients. Our patient now is the planet, possibly the only life in the universe.
Helen, I want to thank you so much for your time. Could you direct people to your website or any website that you'd want to call out right now and mention your book again?
My home website is .com. I've written about 8 books, I think. There's also another book about to come out called Crisis Without End. Yes, there's another book about to come out called Crisis Without End about the Fukushima accident, and that will be out in July. So if you go to helencaldicott.com, you'll see all my books. Go to another one called HelenCaldicottFoundation.org, and you'll then be able to download a symposium I held at the New York Academy of Medicine last year called The Medical and Ecological Consequences of Fukushima, with the leading scientists, oceanographers, evolutionary biologists, physicists, physicians in the world. And listen to that and read all the articles on that webpage, and you will be very, very well educated. And I would also humbly suggest that you read my books because, as Jefferson said, an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. Become informed, take on the President of the United States, who is your representative, and all your congresspeople and senators, and beat them around the head with knowledge and information, and make sure they're as well educated as you. Go on the television, go on talkback shows, write letters to the editor, write op-ed pieces, and lead a revolution in America to save the planet.
I've got absolutely nothing I can add to that. Very well said. Words to live by. Our guest has been Helen Caldicott, MD. Helen, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good. Let me know how it goes.
Oh, I will. Thank you so much. I very, very much appreciate your time.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.